I am so excited about our keynote speaker. He was my first choice for keynote for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is that he has been everywhere that I've been trying to go with my legal advocacy over the last 15 years. We have a former student from our the clinical law program that I ran before I came to this university, and we were bringing lawsuits on behalf of Gitmo detainees. And when I'm looking at impact litigation and people who are on the ground conducting inspections at that facility, and we're looking at the violation of their human rights and constitutional rights, Lee Gelernt was there. And a few years later, when we were meeting people from Muslim countries who were arriving into the United States, many of whom were living here, had families here, and we were trying to basically meet them at their gates to accompany them through, the process. And we're looking at the litigation that's being brought so that they can, return to their families here in the United States and return to their lives in the United States. There was Lee. And when I was looking at family separation and kids literally being taken from their mothers and fathers' arms and thinking, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? We need to end this. There was Lee. And I have been a fangirl of him since I was an adolescent attorney. And so when he immediately said yes, that he would love to be the keynote here today, I was just thrilled, because he is arguably making more difference for large scale children and families arriving to the United States through his impact litigation than any of the rest of us are trying to do day in and day out. He scored a huge win in federal court when he had a judge in one of the most impactful case in this point in American history, had that judge rule that families have a right to be together, even if they are not U.S. citizen. And that this is a right that's guaranteed under the Constitution. What you don't know is that this litigation is continuing on to this day, and Lee will be able to talk to you about that and so much more. So let's give a round of applause to Lee.
So for you young people, it's always good to write your own introduction and then have someone else say it. Thank you, Warren, for that really nice introduction, and for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. This is an incredibly important symposium because it does bring together different disciplines, which I think is at this point the only way we can really push back, is to combine forces. It can't just be in the courtroom. It can't just be political. The artistic community can't do it alone. And so it really, the medical community, obviously, to combine it. So I actually want to start with something that I usually end with, just because I want to pick up on something Scott said as a preliminary matter. There's a lot of talk about finding the ultimate solutions, systemic solutions, but those are hard to come by. They really are. But what Scott said, I think, is right, is that ultimately the hope has to come from just doing what you can in individual cases. Just help one person a day, even if it's just being friendly. If you can take on a case, if you can, as a doctor, deal with one person, as an artist, do one thing. I have so many young people say to me, well, I'd like to do a case that's on the front page of the New York Times. And that's all well and good, but it's not realistic. The systemic cases come every once in a while. And that, and I'm saying that as someone who's about to just spend 30 minutes talking about an impact case, but just try and help one person. And I also don't underestimate the impact you can have just by being on the side of a vulnerable person. I remember one of my first cases when I first started at the ACLU in the 90s was a case in Texas. And I went down there, and I was sort of fresh out of law school and clerkships. And I went down there and I met with an organizer who was the same age as me. We were both in our mid-20s. And she brought in the client who was a 20-year-old woman who had escaped from a Northern Triangle country and was scared out of her mind and had signed misleading forms that she couldn't read, agreeing to be deported, even though she had no idea what she had signed. And the organizer, again, this woman was the same age as me, in mid-20s, said to the person, she started by saying, Lee is a muy importante abogado, very important lawyer who's come from New York to help you. And so we had the meeting, and after the meeting, I was sort of very glib, and I said to the organizer when the client had left, you should have said I was a muy importante lawyer. And, a few weeks later, I started thinking about it, how much wiser this organizer, same age as me, was. She understood what this woman needed to hear, that someone in the establishment was on her side, was going to work with her. And in this case, it was a lawyer, for those of you who are law students or young lawyers, but it could have been a doctor, it could have been anybody who she viewed as being as part of the establishment. And that's what she needed to hear. And so don't ever underestimate how important it is to just show a vulnerable person that you're on their side and you're going to be trying to help them. So I want to thank Scott and the others who made the point, but Scott, made that point. I think it is critical that ultimately we're just going to need to keep fighting one day at a time. And if systemic solutions arise, that's great. And we obviously need people working on those systemic solutions. And I certainly, as an impact lawyer, don't mean to suggest we shouldn't, but I really don't think people should lose hope if those systemic solutions are not coming about quickly. Just do something that day that helps one person. So as Warren said, I want to talk about the ACLU's Miss L family separation lawsuit. And that lawsuit happened under the Trump administration, obviously, that family separation policy, which ripped little children away from their parents. I want to talk about it for three reasons, even though it was the prior administration's policy. One is because, as Warren said, the harm is ongoing and the lawsuit is not over. The second reason is because there are still some people who think that the policy should be reenacted. I'm sure some of you are aware that President Trump on a CNN town hall said he would do it again. So I don't think that we are necessarily out of the woods. The third reason is maybe the most important for purposes of our discussion here, is I think the family separation lawsuit is a good lens through which to look at how we try and shape the narrative, how we reach the public, what works, what doesn't work, and what are the real challenges. And that's what I'm hoping to end with and hopefully spur some discussion. Obviously, a lot of you touched on it this morning in very thoughtful ways, and I want to try and continue that. So in 2017, thanks to a lot of people in the room and advocates around the country, we began learning that children were being taken away from their parents in a systemic way. By the time the holidays hit in 2017, we had heard that there may be hundreds of children who had been separated. Right in the beginning of the winter, 2018, I went out to San Diego to visit a woman who was in detention, Miss L. She had escaped the Congo with her 6-year-old daughter. And I went out to visit with her to understand exactly what happened. So, because we knew at this point that we were going to file a lawsuit, we needed a plaintiff, and we also wanted to understand exactly how it was happening on the ground from certain people. And I got out there and it was shocking. She had lost so much weight. She was gaunt, not sleeping, distraught, and recounted the story of how she had come to a port of entry. And again, for that narrative out there being pushed by some people that everyone is crossing illegally, she was on a journey for months and months, and the journey is recounted in an interesting New York Times Sunday piece with her and her daughter on the cover, a magazine piece. And She recounted how she made it months and months on her journey, you know, begging for food, walking barefoot for hundreds of miles, in danger, finally got to a port of entry at San Ysidro in San Diego, said that she wanted to apply for asylum. Her and her child were put in detention for 4 days in a sort of makeshift detention motel. And then they were brought into different rooms, and she heard through the wall that her child scream, "Mommy, mommy, don't let them take me away." They took the child away. They took the mother to detention. They didn't tell her where the child had been taken for 4 days. She barely spoke to the child, maybe once every 3 weeks, for a few minutes. The child had been sent to Chicago to a facility, and this was 4 months later, and the mother had no understanding of what was happening, where her child was, whether she would ever see her child again. And so we knew we wanted to file a class action lawsuit, but this woman was in such desperate straits that we decided to immediately file for her, and a few weeks later file the class action when we had all those papers together. We went into court, and the government said, look, this is just a one-off thing, and we couldn't be sure she wasn't a trafficker because she didn't have her papers with her showing who she was and who her child was. And we said to the judge, well, of course she didn't. She spent 3 months coming here. She didn't have any of her belongings. Everything was stolen. And moreover, Your Honor, to the extent it matters, asylum seekers often don't have papers. They just need to escape. And the government said, well, she could have been a trafficker then. And we said, well, she looked identical to her daughter. The daughter was screaming, "Mommy, mommy, don't let them take me away." And in the middle of the discussion, the judge just cut through it all and said, is the mother willing to take a DNA test? And we said, of course she is. They did the DNA test. Of course it was the mother. And so that became one of the things we saw over time is and I want to preface this by saying the trafficking issue is a real issue, and we all need to deal with this and not just think of it as a conservative issue. Maybe they are trying to beat the drum politically. It's a real issue, but nonetheless, what we saw then is it being turned into a pretext that they could just say everyone was a trafficker and take the child away. Anyway, we filed the class action, and we alleged that we thought there may be up to 500 children who had been separated. By the time we had the hearing in May of 2018, the New York Times had broke that they thought there were 700 kids who had been separated. And we walked into court, and the judge asked the government, is that 700 number accurate? The government's first response is, well, we don't know who leaked that, which of course is a non-response. The government then said, we have no reason to believe it's inaccurate. The government then said, but we still don't have a policy. The judge rejected that based on how many people we were alleging separated and the government's verification of the New York Times numbers. In any event, 3 days later, then Attorney General Sessions, stood up and announced that they had a policy. Undoubtedly, DOJ knew that that was going to happen. They said there was no policy. They then turned to say, well, yes, the plaintiffs have shown that there is a long, venerable history of family unity in this country, and that children can't be taken away from their parents unless they're in imminent harm. But we don't think those same constitutional rights should apply to children at the border, and we think we can do this. The judge fortunately rejected it and ultimately issued a decision calling the policy brutal, conscience shocking, and told the government, produce to the ACLU a list of all the names of children who have been separated, and I want them reunified immediately. The government came in with a list of 2,700 children. The government said, we will try and reunify them, but there are roughly 470 parents who have already been deported without their children. We don't intend to look for them. And we don't believe that they should be reunited because they're already out of the country. And I want to return to that part because that's one of the things that's still ongoing. The judge stayed on top of the government, gave them deadlines. We suggested 14 days for children under 5 and 30 days for everyone else. And just as a side note, we went to the medical community and asked, what should the cutoff be for the 14 days, under 5, under 7, under 3? The medical community was understandably unwilling to be on record as saying this day, this amount of years is where the trauma is not as severe, given that the trauma is so severe. I mean, maybe they were, at 16, 17, it's a little different. So we ultimately just read between the lines and took as under 5. And on the Late Show with Stephen Colbert, he said, oh yeah, the ACLU said under 5. Of course, a 6-year-old's fine being separated, but it was, attention to the issue. And so that's where we were, and the government missed those deadlines, but they ultimately reunited the children and parents who were still in the US. A few months later, HHS came out with an investigative report that said, wait, there were way more than 2,700 children. These are just the children where the most recent separations. At the beginning of the administration, there were hundreds and hundreds more separated. We went back to court and the Trump administration said, well, those children are already out of our custody. Yeah, they may not be with their parents, but so they shouldn't be part of the case. The judge said, no way, they're part of the case. They've been separated and they may now be separated for much longer than these other children. And the government said, well, frankly, Your Honor, we didn't keep records of all the parents and children, and we're going to need 2 years to give the ACLU the list of names, not to find the parents and children, just to give us a list of the names. The judge put his foot down and said, no, I want the names given to the ACLU on a rolling basis. And ultimately, at the end of 6 months, I want every name given. Turns out that there were at least 5,500 children separated. And I say at least because we still don't know the full count. We think because the record keeping was so poor that there may still be children out there who were separated who we don't know about. But what we do know is of the 5,500 plus children, at least 500 were under 5. Some were still breastfeeding. One was 6 months old. There were little babies and toddlers, as everyone has talked about already today. We are unfortunately, and I'm going to get to this, still looking for some families, and hundreds are not yet reunified. And that, that's part of the ongoing issue, as well as the emotional, psychological, physical harm that resulted. But I want to turn to that at the end. People have spoken about the harm, and I think by now the harm is well documented by all of by the medical profession. Some of you are here. Dr. Shapiro put in a very powerful affidavit in our case. Other individual doctors came to the rescue and put in affidavits about what family separation can do to children. Physicians for Human Rights has called it torture to separate a young child. The president of the American Academy of Pediatrics has called it government-sanctioned child abuse. The harm, it's almost impossible to fully describe the harm. I thought I understood it, having children of my own, and understood it intellectually, and I grasped the basic points that the medical profession was telling me, but I think ultimately I didn't fully understand it until I started meeting the families and the children. One doctor described it to me as, with separation, think about the worst 2 minutes of your life where you're the most anxious, the most scared, the most traumatized, but you have adult facilities to deal with it, but how intense that was and how painful. And then think about a 3-year-old child who that's going on 24/7 for months. Every day they're separated and not sure what's going to happen to them and don't have their mother or father around. That's what they're feeling. And so that it's just constant and builds on it to the point where it can actually change the child's brain structure. So, the harm, again, the medical profession has done an unbelievable job of documenting it. And needless to say, we could not have gotten anywhere in this case in court or publicly without the support of the medical profession. But for me, it was ultimately always the individual stories that were most compelling, because you can talk about the medical evidence, for a while, and on TV, you can talk about it, and it's pretty quickly people are flipping the channel. And so for me, what ultimately moved people, and for me, moved myself, were the individual stories. And so one of our plaintiffs had an 18-month-old child, and they made her strap the child in the back seat of a CBP vehicle. The child was screaming and crying. They made her strap him in. They wouldn't let her comfort him. The car pulled away, and she described the little boy craning his neck out the back to get one last glimpse of his mother. And that was the image that stuck with her all the months the child was separated. Another 4-year-old boy from Honduras had glasses, needed glasses. And when they came to take him away, he was fortunately wearing his glasses, but they wouldn't let him get his glasses case. So all day long, all the mother thought about was, will they show him a safe place to keep his glasses? What happens if his glasses break? Will they get him a new pair? Or is he walking around not able to see? Another father told us about when they came to take away his 7-year-old boy. He just said, please give me 1 minute to brace the child for what's going to happen. They wouldn't give him the 1 minute. They just ripped the child away. The child's holding onto his father's leg, begging and screaming, where are they taking me? Where are they taking me? So it was just story after story. So often the parents wouldn't even be able to say goodbye to their children, or had to see their children being marched out through a glass window and just had to wave to their children. The stories were just absolutely brutal, and they obviously don't end after reunification. One of the first children we reunified was a 4-year-old boy, and the mother said that when the child got home, all he would ask every night is, are they going to come and take me away again in the middle of the night if I go to sleep, right? And so for you parents, you've all had that situation of talking to your kids, no, there's no monsters in your room, it's fine, you keep the light on. But what is this mother going to tell the child? They did come and take the child away again in the middle of the night. Another 3-year-old boy we represented, when he came home, he would just stand all day long by the window looking out to see if men were coming to take him away again. You know, and what the medical profession explained to us, which we really saw firsthand, is that the only reason a small child is not scared of the world all the time is because they think their parents can protect them. And so these children learned very early, too early, that that wasn't true. They would be pulled away from their parents, screaming and crying and looking into their parents' eyes, and their parents would just be staring at them hopelessly and helplessly and not be able to do anything. And at that moment, the child realized, well, my parent can't actually save me from anything. And the parents were too scared to speak up. Parents would tell me, I felt like if I said anything, they would treat my child worse. One mother got up the courage to ask, where are you taking my child? And they said, we're taking him to Chicago. And they just walked away, leaving her to guess whether Chicago was a place, a person, a government agency. And obviously, it's not just the children that were hurt and traumatized. The parent-child relationship has been so distorted because the children were too young to understand why their parents couldn't help them. So invariably, the children have come back and asked, Mommy, Daddy, why did you not fight for me? Didn't you love me enough to keep me? And there's just no way. The parents are living with such guilt, and there's no way for the parent really to ultimately explain to the child. You know, when I was in El Salvador, I met with one father who said that when he finally got his child back after 3 months, the child got off the plane, and literally the first thing he said is, Daddy, why did you let them take me? Why didn't you want them any longer? And so that's what the parents are living with. And, you know, we understandably focus on the children. And I think there's a lot of reasons we focus on the children. But I hope people don't forget what's happened with the parents, that there's going to be the trust that's going to have to be built back, hopefully with the help of medical professionals, but that trust is going to have to be built back. We're also seeing situations where the child was so young that they barely remember their parent, and now they've been given to someone who wants to keep the child, and the child says, well, Mommy, you're going to be living in this place, and that's not as nice a house as where I've been given, so I'd rather stay there. You know, and that's heartbreaking for the parent, obviously. So I think, you know, ultimately, it's those stories that we try to amplify. We're still trying to amplify. One Why did the Trump administration do it? You know, people touched on it before. Laura touched on it before. Others have touched on it. They thought this is the cruelest thing we can do. If we take a child away, even a baby, people will give up their asylum claims if they're already here. And also the word will get back to Central America, don't come because you're going to have your child taken. And there's obviously two things wrong with that. One is, even if it were a deterrent, in the United States, we simply don't do things like that, right? I mean, you can always think of the most cruel way to try and deter a crime, a white collar crime, or chop people's hand, you know, and we just don't do that. And I think that's one of the reasons why someone like Laura Bush on her own wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post saying, look, my husband was a Republican president. He had different views about immigration than some others, but there has to be a line we don't cross in the United States. But the second reason is functional. It's just obviously wasn't going to be a deterrent. Every administration has thought for the first 30 seconds of their term, maybe we should separate parents and children. And it's quickly discarded as too cruel, but also gratuitous cruelty and not a deterrent. And I think you all who are in this space know that ultimately what pushes people are the dangers they face in their country or other compelling factors for them. No one really wants to pick up and leave their country and walk thousands of miles with a 2-year-old if they don't have to. And so when I asked parents, would you have come anyway if you had known your child was going to be taken from you? They just sort of shrugged and said, Lee, what choice did I have? I couldn't stay and have my child be killed or me be killed. And so it wasn't really that kind of choice. And that's why it ultimately wasn't a deterrent. And that's why all these harsh immigration policies we see are not really deterrents. When I was in Guatemala, I met a father, you know, when he talked about the choice of having his child come to the US, stay in the US. And he just said, look, the gang slip papers under my door every day with my children's names and ages. And they say it's either he joins the gang or we're going to kill him. And so the father says the hardest thing I could ever do in my life is give up my child, but even harder would be to keep him here and have him killed. So ultimately, there was going to be no deterrent. And this was intentional, gratuitous cruelty. No matter how they tried to spin it, the Trump administration tried to spin it, it was just absolute gratuitous cruelty. So that brings us to where we are now. As I said, there are still hundreds and hundreds of children who are still separated, and that's for two reasons. One is there are some families we still haven't found. There also are hundreds of families who we have found, but we found them during the Trump administration and we couldn't get them back to the US. Now that the Biden administration has set up a task force and agreed to let parents come back and reunify with their children in the US, we have to recontact them. And that's not been always easy because they've changed their phone numbers, some are in hiding. It's just been difficult all around. The process for bringing them back has also been, I think, a little too cumbersome and got off to a slow start, but I don't want to focus on that because I think the Biden administration's task force has been doing a good job. There's always things they could do that are better to improve the situation, but there is a process. And so our hope is that all the children we've at least found, the parents we've found, will ultimately get reunited relatively soon. The question is, are we going to find the remaining children? And the reason we're having trouble finding the remaining children is what I alluded to earlier, is that the Trump administration just didn't keep records. So what happened was when the judge learned that parents had been deported without their children, and just to give you a sense of how that happened, the parents would sign waiver forms or be just physically removed, not really knowing, thinking their children were going to come with them. They'd be told their children are going to meet them on the plane. The plane would take off. The parent would be looking out the window and the child wouldn't be there. They would never bring the child there. And so there were hundreds and hundreds of parents, well over 1,000, who were deported without their children. The Trump administration's records would sometimes say parent in Honduras, or maybe they would have the city. If we were really lucky, they might have the town. And so the Trump administration said, we're not going to look for the parents overseas. And so I stood up in court, not really fully understanding what I was getting into back in 2018, and said, well, then, Your Honor, we'll fine them. And the Trump administration lawyer said, well, that's great. If the ACLU is going to fine them, they'll fine them. So we formed a steering committee headed by a law firm, Paul Weiss, not this Paul Weiss, Justice in Motion, just based out of Atlanta, that works with human rights observers and lawyers in Central America, and Kids in Need of Defense, and the Women's Refugee Commission. And we had to do mass mailings, posters, find phone numbers any way we could. Ultimately, though, the human rights observers had to go door to door on the ground looking for families in very dangerous conditions. And the remaining families, we don't know where they are. You know, hopefully they're safe, maybe even through self-help. They have found their child, but we just don't know. But we're now 5 years later, and this effort, not government funded, is still ongoing, looking for these families. And so I think, you know, that's one part of it, right? Is we still have all these families to reunite. Another part is obviously the trauma that was inflicted on these children and doing what we can to make them whole. So we are currently in settlement negotiations with the Biden administration on the Misael case. And that's going constructively, and that will hopefully cover everything from finding the remaining families to reuniting them, to providing some pathway to facilitate an asylum claim, all those types of things. We also, with other groups, try to negotiate over monetary compensation. And there had been individual lawsuits, including some by the ACLU, what are called Federal Tort Claim Act lawsuits for money damages for the families. And we had been having global negotiations. The ACLU and a few other firms and NGOs had been having negotiations to get monetary compensation. And someone in the administration leaked it that each child and parent were going to get at least $450,000. President Biden was asked about it by a Fox News reporter, and he seemed to be caught off guard, and he said, no, there's no way we're giving that money. The negotiations broke down because there was enormous political backlash. The Democrats didn't really, and liberals didn't really come to the rescue, and the Republicans just took over the narrative, saying not a penny for illegal aliens. And I think that's where I want to sort of talk now about the public relations aspect of it, because what it showed was that it's not easy to sustain public outrage. And what it's also shown over the years since the Misael lawsuit is that it's not easy to create that kind of public outrage and public sympathy for other immigration issues where there's enormous harm. You know, even the family separation lawsuit was hard in the beginning to get to, from a public relations standpoint, to get it attention. You know, when we filed it, there was just a little bit of notice in the media, despite us trying to bring it to people's attention. I remember going in to one of the big cable shows and going to talk about something other than family separation, but just there were all the anchors there just happened to be milling about. And I said, you know, we just filed this lawsuit and it's a big deal. The Trump administration is purposely taking away little children. And I could not get them to focus on it. But slowly, through a lot of effort, but also I think more importantly, the tape that ProPublica got that leaked of the little children crying and screaming, and just people recognizing how young the children were, it slowly hit the point where it became not just a national, but a worldwide issue, right? If you all remember back to that summer of 2018, you know, it was one of those real civil rights moments, protests in the streets everywhere. It was wall-to-wall coverage. It was the morning shows all the way through the late night shows, constant 4 or 5 pages in every newspaper about it, media worldwide talking about it. And it seemed like, okay, everyone, we're going to be able to sustain this, right? people would come up to me and say, well, I'm a Republican. I don't really like all the macro immigration policy you promote, but I can't stand this. You know, the Pope spoke out about it. Hollywood spoke out about it, like at the very, A-list level. There was Laura Bush, there was everyone. It was just religious conservative leaders, and it finally, boiled over. But then years later, we say, look, these families deserve compensation. And everyone said, well, 450,000 sounds like a lot. And I don't even mean conservatives and Republicans. I mean, even our side. And so maybe that's because they viewed it differently, getting your child back versus compensation. But on the other hand, if you said to a middle-class family, your child was intentionally taken away for 5 months, you only spoke to the child a little bit, you weren't necessarily sure you would ever see the child again, you think 450,000 is too much? I mean, people would be saying, are you kidding? There's no amount of money that can compensate for me having my 3-year-old child taken away. But yet what we saw is no one really paying attention. And I think, the questions we have to ask are, was it because Trump was no longer in power and that's really what was happening? I don't want to think about it as we needed a boogeyman, that there really was genuine sympathy. And my own feeling is it was probably a little of both, but, we weren't able to generate the sympathy. People move on. It's understandable. There's too much going on. They can only pay attention to an issue for so long. The other thing that we weren't able to do is transfer all that public outrage to other issues. So even under the Biden administration, the policies have been extremely harsh at the border. You all know about them, the Title 42 policy that just pushed people back across the border, families and children. And, they would literally be pushed back across the border across a bridge without any amount of process. And, it was like walking the plank, which one Trump appointed DC Circuit judge actually said. You'd see parents and little children walking back across the bridge at night. The cartels knew what times they would be pushed back. They're just sitting there waiting for them. Unbelievable abuse. Someone mentioned the barbed wire in Texas is going on. And so there's been all these restrictive asylum policies. There's obviously everything to do with Flores and detention conditions, but we haven't been able to bring that kind of outrage. And, to some extent, maybe it's understandable that it was so visceral for everyone who's ever lost their child for 30 seconds in a grocery store or a playground and felt the sweat coming down there, has known that feeling. But I think we are really in a tricky situation, how to regain the narrative, and how can we do it? Because I think it's going to take a lot of work, and I don't want to splash cold water on it, but I think, obviously getting better people elected is great, but I'm not really sure at this point that even basic Democrats are all that sympathetic about what's going on at the border. I do think I hear from tons of people who were basically liberal, border seems out of control. We got to do something about it. And so all the things people have said, including bringing the art community involved, is critical, but it is going to be a struggle. And there's a lot of strategic decisions we need to make about how to talk about it. And, we faced those during Missel. One I faced from the very beginning was, do I come right out and say, this is torture, this is child abuse? People were saying you need to do that, Lee, and I chose not to. I chose to sort of let the stories and the facts speak for themselves, fearing that backlash, that it would only take a little bit of a nudge to have people, say, well, wait, these are illegal aliens, that kind of thing. But that was a strategic decision. The other kind of strategic decision was, do we blend this into separation more generally, right? There were people saying you need to talk about slavery. You need to talk about Native Americans being separated. You need to talk about children of color being disproportionately separated from their parents by social services in cities all across New York. There was a banner up in Harlem at the time saying family separation has been happening to Black children for years and years and years, being taken away. We chose not to broaden the lens for strategic, tactical reasons. Whether that was right or wrong, I don't know. The other thing that's happened is that because family separation got so much traction, everyone wants to call everything family separation, right? And they're not wrong necessarily to think of it as family separation. A family that's been living here for 30 years, the father is deported, the child is a US citizen, is not going with the father probably, that is a form of family separation. Is it the same thing as what Trump was doing of physically taking the children away intentionally? You know, that's a difficult question. And so if we talk about everything as family separation, you can dilute it, but ultimately things are hostile out there, right? And it's not, I'm just gonna show you, I mean, the only reason I'm gonna show you this 2-minute clip is not because it's so unusual, but just because it's literally from last week in a congressional hearing that I testified in. And I think this is what we're seeing, as there was a first in 2018, a timid attempt at dealing with family separation by conservatives. You know, they didn't really want any part of it. But now it's gotten to the point where they're just lashing out. And so I would maybe just show that clip, for that 1 minute or 2 minute clip. Okay, so it's basically just Marjorie Taylor Greene screaming at me. Why are you being so hypocritical, defending the Biden administration, which we're not really, but saying that President Trump did all these bad things to kids when all he was trying to do was protect kids, you know, and it just, and she ended by saying, I don't actually want you to answer it. I just wanted to make this point, you know? And so I think we're in a tricky situation here now. It's with the conversation I think we all ought to have. I think we've been having it all morning. And I think that's why this symposium is so important, is bringing people from different disciplines, because we need everyone's voice. But I do think that it is not going to be all that easy to regain the narrative for systemic change. We're going to have to use all the economic arguments. We're going to have to use, you know, the arguments about how horrible this is from a moral, ethical standpoint, a values argument. We're going to have, it's the medical argument. Artists are going to, but it is going to be difficult. But I just hope that, you know, we need to talk about this so we never again see something like family separation. In my 30 years at the ACLU, it is by far the worst thing that I have ever seen. And it's really an absolute moral stain on the country. You can play the first.
Mr. Gelernt, I'm sorry, I can't see your.
That's all right, Gelernt, sorry.
Gelernt. Yes. You know, I find it so hypocritical of you to listen to you basically mock former President Trump's administration, attacking the policies of testing for DNA, keeping children safe while they are ensuring that they are with a parent, while this administration, under Secretary Mayorkas, under Joe Biden, this administration, Democrats have lost over 85,000 children in our country. We cannot find them. We cannot find them. And you know what? Here, listen to this. This is so disturbing to me. The very fact that this administration sent more than 100 children to the same address in Austin, Texas, while other Texas addresses received 44 and 25 minors respectively, that is outrageous. That is outrageous. And I don't have a question for you. I just want you to understand that there is no criticism of the former administration and the ridiculous numbers and the so-called separating children from their parents. No, that's called keeping them safe.
I guess that's the right note to end on. Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry I ran over, but I'm happy to, yeah, I got it.
Thank you. Are you still willing to take a couple of questions, Lee?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry
Okay.
it went long.
Janine?
I'm wondering if the ACLU has considered taking Stephen J. Miller to court for abusing these children.
Yeah.
Because if I separated a child from their parent in the United States, I would be in jail.
So that's a great question. So for the non-lawyers, there are ways to go to court that are civil and there are ways that are criminal. No private person can bring a criminal action. We had hoped that the Biden administration, given how President Biden talked during the second presidential debate about this, he used the word criminal. This is criminal. They have not been willing to take that step. We have sued Stephen Miller and others responsible in court civilly for money damages. So far, we haven't had any success because of doctrines by the Supreme Court that limit the ability to sue federal officers for money. We're still going to plug along, but the best we can do is money. It's better than nothing. We had urged the Biden administration to investigate this for criminal action. They haven't been willing to, I think likely for political reasons. But it's a very good question. And because that ultimately, that's going to be where some accountability will have to come.
Abby, do we have a question from online? One more question from in the room. Alan?
Lee, that was incredible. Unfortunately, my burrito was in my throat the whole time, but luckily you showed Marjorie Taylor Greene, so I threw it up, and I could talk now. I want to highlight a couple of things that you said just for the audience, because I think the collaboration between human rights lawyers like yourself and the medical community was in many ways a first. At least it was a first for me and a first for many of my colleagues, also in mental health, who wrote declarations, and the power that it gave us to be able to fight against something that was, against everything we trained to do, which was protect children. It was hard to deal with that rage that Mauricio talks about, because, there's just, you don't get trained to do this. And in our practice, we saw about 20 families that had been separated. And, when we talk about deterrence, I'm thinking about one family, a mom from Honduras who had HIV, who had an attempt on her life when her husband found out that she had HIV, and she fled the country with her 2 children, and they were separated, and the mom was sent to Seattle and the children were sent to the Bronx. And when they came together, the healing took, I would say, close to 2 or 3 years before the children could even talk about their experience. And if that was a form of deterrence, I just want to share some numbers with everybody, which was in 2018, 105,770 individuals of families were apprehended at the border. That was in 2018, when zero tolerance policy was in effect. In 2019, we saw 436,550 members of families who came across the border. So much for deterrence. And actually, that 105 number was the highest number we had seen really ever. And that was after families had been detained for sometimes years. And we saw that in Berks Family Detention Center and other detention centers around the country. So as a deterrent, it certainly didn't work. And then just lastly, I do feel that the work that you did and the work that professional organizations did and made public really got the general public to really cry out. And I do think that enormous national cry out of what was happening really and help get the Trump administration to reverse that policy. So thank you for your work. It's hard, for us who are in pediatrics and who are taking care of children who have been separated from the parents. The work that the ACLU is doing and that Lee is doing is, I don't even know where to put it in the frame of moral goodness. So just thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And I would urge people to read Alan's affidavit that we submitted in Miss L. I can make that available, as well as the other doctors. But I think there were so many doctors who came forward in Miss L.
Thank you so much, Lee.
Thank you.